The storm descended on Colorado territory with the swift fury of a scorned lover, turning the afternoon sky to midnight in a matter of minutes. Elizabeth Wilson clutched her swollen belly as her horse whinnied in panic, rearing against the first lash of rain that pelted them both like tiny bullets. At 7 months pregnant and miles from anywhere, she knew with terrible certainty that she had made a fatal mistake in trying to outrun the weather. "Easy, boy," she soothed, though her own heart hammered against her ribs. Lightning split the sky, and in that brilliant flash, she saw the path ahead had vanished beneath rivulets of mud. The mountains loomed like sentinels in the distance, indifferent to her plight. Black Hawk was still hours away, and the cabin she'd left behind that morning seemed like a dream from another life. Elizabeth had been traveling to meet her sister in Denver after the death of her husband, Thomas. 3 months gone, taken by typhoid fever, leaving her alone with their unborn child and a mountain of debt. The small Missouri farm they'd worked together had been sold to pay creditors, and with nowhere else to turn, she'd written to her sister Mary, who had married well in the Colorado territory. The letter that had come back promised sanctuary, but the journey had been harder than she'd imagined. Now, as thunder rolled across the sky like a stampede, Elizabeth realized she might never complete it. Rain soaked through her woolen cloak within minutes, plastering her dress to her skin. The cold penetrated to her bones as the wind howled, driving the deluge sideways. Her horse stumbled, nearly sending her tumbling to the ground. "Please," she whispered, though whether to God or the storm itself she couldn't say. The child within her stirred, as if sensing her fear, and she placed a protective hand over her belly. "I'll find a shelter, I promise." But the trail had disappeared, and with visibility reduced to mere feet, Elizabeth could no longer tell which direction led to town and which deeper into the wilderness. The mountains were obscured now, offering no guidance. When her horse refused to move any farther, she slid from the saddle, her boots sinking into mud that reached her ankles. Leading the terrified animal by the reins, she staggered forward, searching for any landmark, any sign of human habitation. Her legs trembled with exhaustion, and a sharp pain lanced through her lower back. Too early, she thought desperately. It's too early for the baby. Elizabeth didn't see the ravine until she was nearly upon it, a rushing torrent of water where a dry creek bed had been hours before. Her horse reared again, pulling free of her grip, and bolted back the way they had come. "No," she cried, but her voice was lost in the storm's fury. Alone now, soaked to the skin, she followed the edge of the ravine, hoping it might lead to a crossing or perhaps a cabin. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably, and her vision swam. Another contraction gripped her, stronger this time, and she doubled over with a gasp. When it passed, she forced herself onward, each step a victory against the elements. The rain had plastered her auburn hair to her face, and she pushed it back with trembling fingers. It was then that she saw at the faintest glow of light through the curtain of rain. A lantern, swinging in the storm. Elizabeth tried to call out, but her voice emerged as little more than a rasp. The light moved, then steadied, as if whoever carried it had spotted her. She took another step toward it and felt the ground give way beneath her feet. The muddy bank of the ravine collapsed, sending her sliding toward the rushing water. She scrabbled desperately for purchase, managing to catch hold of an exposed tree root. Hanging there with the torrent mere inches below her boots, Elizabeth summoned the last of her strength to cry out, "Help me, please." Through the rain, she saw a figure descend toward her, moving with surprising grace on the treacherous slope. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a cowboy hat. He reached her side and extended a gloved hand. "Hold on to me," he commanded, his voice deep and steady against the storm's chaos. "I've got you." Elizabeth grasped his hand, feeling the strength in his grip as he pulled her from danger. Another contraction seized her as he lifted her into his arms, and she couldn't suppress a moan of pain. "The baby," she gasped. "I think something's wrong." His expression changed, concern replacing determination. "My cabin's close by. Can you hold on that long?" She nodded, though in truth, she wasn't certain of anything anymore. The world had narrowed to pain and cold, and the solid warmth of the stranger's chest against her cheek. He carried her with surprising ease despite the mud and driving rain, his stride purposeful and sure. The cabin materialized out of the storm like a mirage, a solid structure of logs and stone, with light spilling from its windows. He shouldered open the door, bringing her into warmth and light that made her eyes sting after so long in the darkness. Gently, he laid her on a bed pushed against the far wall, then quickly stoked the fire in the hearth until it roared with welcome heat. When he turned back to her, Elizabeth could see him clearly for the first time, a man perhaps 30 years of age, with eyes the color of a summer sky and hair the rich brown of fertile earth. His face was weathered by sun and wind, but handsome in a rugged way that spoke of a life lived outdoors. "My name's Zachary Holcomb," he said as he removed his dripping hat and coat. "Most folks just call me Zach." "Elizabeth Wilson," she managed between shallow breaths. "I was trying to reach Black Hawk when the storm caught me." "You're still a good 10 miles out," he replied, his brow furrowing as he took in her condition. "And in no state to travel. Rest now. You're safe here." Those simple words nearly undid her composure. After weeks of traveling alone, after months of grief and worry, to hear someone tell her she was safe felt like absolution. Tears mingled with the rainwater on her cheeks. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than before, and she couldn't suppress a cry. Zach's expression shifted to alarm. "How far along are you?" he asked, moving to her side. 7 months, she gasped when the pain receded. "It's too early. The baby can't come yet." His jaw tightened. "I'll fetch Mrs. Oakhurst from the neighboring homestead. She's the closest thing to a midwife we have in these parts." Elizabeth clutched his arm. "Please, don't leave me alone." Zach hesitated, clearly torn between the need to get help and her plea. Outside, thunder crashed so loudly the cabin's windows rattled in their frames. "The storm's too dangerous to travel through right now, even for me," he admitted. "And it would take me over an hour to reach the Oakhurst place in this weather." He ran a hand through his damp hair. "I've helped birth calves and foals, but never a human child." Despite everything, Elizabeth almost smiled at the uncertainty in his voice. "I've never had one before either." "We'll have to learn together." His answering smile transformed his face, softening the hard lines and revealing a dimple in his right cheek. "You've got grit, Mrs. Wilson, I'll give you that." "Elizabeth, please," she said. "If you're going to help bring my child into the world, we should be on a first-name basis." "Elizabeth," he repeated, and something in the way he said her name made her heart flutter despite her circumstances. "First, let's get you out of those wet clothes before you catch your death." He turned his back discreetly while she changed into a flannel shirt he provided, which hung to her knees. Her own sodden garments were hung near the fire to dry. The contractions continued, spaced about 20 minutes apart, but they seemed to have stabilized rather than intensified. "Maybe it's false labor," Zach suggested hopefully as he prepared a broth for her to sip. "Brought on by the cold and stress." Elizabeth nodded, wanting to believe him. "I've heard that can happen." The storm raged on outside, but the cabin was snug and warm, the roof sound enough that only an occasional drip found its way inside. Zach moved with the efficiency of a man accustomed to caring for himself, preparing food, stoking the fire, and gathering clean linens just in case. As the hours passed and her clothing dried by the fire, Elizabeth learned that Zach had come to Colorado 5 years earlier, drawn by the silver boom. He'd staked a claim that had yielded enough for him to buy this land, where he now raised horses. "Safer than mining," he explained as he checked on her. "And I prefer the company of horses to most men." "You live out here alone?" she asked, surprised that a man so capable and, she had to admit, handsome hadn't found a wife. A shadow crossed his face. "I was engaged once, back in Kansas. Sarah was her name. Cholera took her before we could marry." "I'm sorry," Elizabeth said softly. "My Thomas died of typhoid 3 months ago." Zach met her gaze, and in that moment, a silent understanding passed between them, the recognition of shared grief. "It's a hard country for tender hearts," he said. By midnight, the contractions had indeed slowed and then stopped altogether. The storm, too, had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean. Through the cabin's small window, Elizabeth could see stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. "You should try to sleep," Zach told her, arranging a pallet for himself near the fire. "I'll be right here if you need anything." Exhaustion dragged at her, but her mind raced with questions about the future. How would she reach her sister now? What would happen when the baby came for real? How would she build a new life as a widow with a newborn? As if sensing her thoughts, Zach spoke from his place by the fire. "First light, I'll ride to Black Hawk and fetch the doctor to check on you. Then, if you're able, I'll escort you to Denver myself." "You do that for a stranger?" she asked, surprised by his generosity. He was quiet for so long she thought he might have fallen asleep. Finally, he said, "Out here, kindness isn't a luxury, Elizabeth. It's how we survive." With those words echoing in her mind, she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd had in months. Morning brought clarity and pain of a different sort, the ache of muscles strained by her ordeal and the remnants of fear. But the sun shone through the windows, casting golden patterns across the rough-hewn floor, and the baby moved within her, strong and reassuring. Zach was already up, his pallet neatly rolled and stored away. He'd prepared a simple breakfast of cornbread and coffee, which he served to her with an awkward courtesy that suggested he wasn't used to having a woman at his table. "The trail to town should be passable now," he said as she ate. "I'll saddle my mare for you. She's gentle and sure-footed. I'll walk alongside." Elizabeth nodded, though the thought of parting from him so soon left her strangely bereft. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done." He waved away her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't true. In a land where survival often depended on looking after oneself first, his willingness to help a pregnant stranger caught in a storm was far from common. Before they could depart, however, the sound of hoofbeats approached the cabin. Zach moved to the window, his posture alert. "Riders coming," he said. "3 of them." Elizabeth felt a flutter of alarm. "Is that unusual out here?" "Yes." He reached for a rifle mounted above the door, checking that it was loaded. "Stay inside." He stepped onto the porch as 3 men reined their horses to a stop in the yard. From where she sat, Elizabeth could see them clearly, 2 younger men flanking an older one whose silver hair gleamed in the sunlight. All 3 were dressed in the practical manner of ranchers or miners, dusty and trail-worn. "Holcomb," the older man called out, his voice carrying easily through the open door. "Thought we might find you here." "Tillman," Zach acknowledged, his tone neutral but wary. "What brings you and your boys this way?" The man named Tillman dismounted, his movements stiff as if from a long ride. "We're tracking a thief. Young fella stole 2 horses from my stable yesterday before the storm hit. Trail led this direction before the rain washed it away." Haven't seen anyone, Zach replied. Just been holed up here waiting out the weather. Tillman's gaze shifted to the cabin door where Elizabeth now stood. His eyebrows rose in surprise. Didn't know you had company, Holcomb. The lady was caught in the storm, Zach explained, his voice taking on an edge. I offered shelter. The older man removed his hat in a gesture of respect. Madam, Randall Tillman at your service. These are my sons, Curtis and Boyd. Elizabeth nodded politely, one hand resting protectively on her belly. Elizabeth Wilson. Mr. Holcomb was kind enough to help me when my horse bolted during the storm. Tillman's weathered face creased in a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Always the hero, ain't you, Holcomb? He turned back to Zach. Still won't sell that water rights claim to me, I reckon. You reckon right, Zach replied evenly. That creek's the lifeblood of my horse operation. And the only thing standing between my cattle and the best grazing land in the county, Tillman countered, his smile fading. I've been more than fair with my offers, and I've been clear with my answers. Zach's hand never strayed far from his rifle. Now, if there's nothing else, the lady needs to get to Black Hawk to see a doctor. Tillman studied them both for a long moment, then settled his hat back on his head. We'll be on our way then, but this conversation ain't over, Holcomb. It never is with you, Tillman. The three men mounted up and rode away, dust rising behind them in the clear morning air. Only when they were out of sight did Zach's shoulders relax. Old dispute? Elizabeth asked as he returned inside. Old and ongoing, he confirmed, replacing the rifle on its hooks. Randall Tillman owns the biggest cattle spread in the county. He wants my land because the creek that runs through it would let him expand his grazing range. And you won't sell, Zach shook his head. This place is all I have. I won't be bullied out of it, not by Tillman or anyone else. He glanced at her. But that's not your concern. Let's get you to town and find that doctor. The journey to Black Hawk took most of the morning. True to his word, Zach walked beside the mare, leading her carefully around obstacles and helping Elizabeth whenever the terrain grew difficult. The town appeared before them just as the sun reached its zenith, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with the mountains rising majestically behind. Black Hawk had grown rapidly since gold was discovered in the nearby hills in '59, and now in 1867 it boasted several saloons, a hotel, a general store, and much to Elizabeth's relief, a doctor's office. Miners and townspeople moved about the main street, paying little attention to the newest arrivals. Dr. Warner was a thin, spectacled man with kind eyes and a gentle touch. After examining Elizabeth, he pronounced both her and the baby healthy, though he warned her against any more strenuous travel for at least a week. The contractions were likely brought on by exhaustion and exposure, he explained. But the child seems determined to stay put for now, which is all to the good. You need rest, Mrs. Wilson. I'm supposed to meet my sister in Denver, Elizabeth said, looking to Zach, who had waited outside during the examination and now stood by her side. Mary's expecting me. Denver's another day's journey at least, the doctor cautioned, and the trail's not easy, especially for a woman in your condition. Zach cleared his throat. She could stay at my place until she's stronger. It's quiet there and I've got the room. Elizabeth stared at him in surprise. It was one thing to offer emergency shelter during a storm, quite another to invite a pregnant stranger to stay. That's very generous, she began hesitantly. But I couldn't impose, it's no imposition, he interrupted. And it would give me peace of mind to know you're recovering properly before you continue your journey. Dr. Warner nodded approvingly. A sensible suggestion, and I can ride out to check on you in a few days. Faced with their united front, Elizabeth found herself agreeing to the plan. A telegram was sent to her sister explaining the delay, and after purchasing a few necessities from the general store, Zach insisting on paying despite her protests, they made their way back to the cabin. The following days established a rhythm unlike anything Elizabeth had known. Zach rose before dawn to tend to his horses, returning mid-morning for a breakfast they shared at the rough-hewn table. He worked until dusk, training the young colts he would sell to the cavalry or to stage companies always in need of fresh stock. Elizabeth, determined not to be a burden, took over the cooking and mending, finding satisfaction in the simple domestic tasks. Her strength returned quickly, but she found herself in no hurry to continue her journey to Denver. The cabin, initially so alien, had begun to feel like home. On the fourth evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Zach asked about her plans. "Your sister must be worried, even with the telegram," he said, his voice careful, neutral. Elizabeth nodded, watching the flames dance. "Mary's always been the worrying kind. She married a banker in Denver last year, a good match, according to our parents. She's offered me a place to stay until the baby comes and help finding work afterward." "What sort of work were you thinking of?" His eyes reflected firelight as he studied her. "Teaching, perhaps. I taught at a small school in Missouri before I married Thomas." She smiled at the memory. "I enjoyed it, though the pay was meager." "Black Hawk's got a schoolhouse," Zach said casually. "No teacher at present, though. The last one left to get married 2 months ago." Elizabeth looked up sharply. "Are you suggesting I might find employment here instead of Denver?" He shrugged, suddenly intent on stoking the fire. "Just mentioning it as a possibility. The town's growing. There are families now, children who need learning. And where would I live? A pregnant widow without connections or references. Here." The word hung between them, simple yet loaded with implications. Zach met her gaze steadily. "Until you found a place of your own, if that's what you wanted, or—" He hesitated, then plunged ahead. "Or you could stay. Permanently." Elizabeth's heart raced. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Holcomb?" "A partnership of sorts," he replied carefully. "This place needs a woman's touch. Well, I've been alone a long time. Too long, maybe, and you need a safe place for you and your child. A marriage of convenience." The concept wasn't unfamiliar in frontier life, where survival often depended on practical arrangements rather than romantic notions. "Call it what you will," Zach said. "I'm not offering hearts and flowers, Elizabeth. Just a home, protection, and my word that I'll treat you and your child with respect." She should have been offended by the practicality of it, perhaps, but instead found herself considering his offer seriously. In the short time she'd known him, Zach had proven himself honorable and kind. The cabin, while rustic, could become a real home with time and care. And Black Hawk, growing as it was, might offer opportunities that would be harder to find in larger Denver. "May I have some time to consider?" she asked finally. He nodded, relief evident in his expression. He'd clearly expected outright rejection. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands." That night, sleep eluded her. Elizabeth lay awake, weighing her options while the child within her turned and kicked as if participating in the debate. By morning, she had made her decision. Zach was already outside, working with a spirited colt in the corral adjacent to the barn. Elizabeth watched from the porch as man and horse moved in an intricate dance of will and trust. There was patience in Zach's movements, a gentle persistence that eventually won the animal's cooperation. When he spotted her, he secured the colt and approached, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air. "I've been thinking about your offer," Elizabeth said without preamble. "And—" His expression gave nothing away, but his knuckles whitened where he gripped the corral fence. "I'm willing to accept with conditions." She took a deep breath. First, this would be a real marriage, not just in name. I won't live a lie, especially not in front of my child. His eyebrows rose slightly, but he nodded. Agreed. What else? Second, if we find we can't make this work, you'll help me establish myself elsewhere. I won't be trapped in an unhappy arrangement. Of course, he said solemnly. I'd never hold you against your will. Elizabeth swallowed hard before stating her final condition. And third, we must be honest with each other. Always. No secrets, no hidden resentments. If this is to be a true partnership, it must be built on truth. Zach studied her for a long moment before extending his hand across the fence. Those are fair terms, Elizabeth Wilson. Do we have an agreement? She placed her hand in his, feeling the calluses that spoke of hard work and the surprising gentleness of his grip. We do, Zachary Holcomb. They were married 3 days later by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Black Hawk. The ceremony took place in the town's small church, witnessed by Dr. Warner, the general store owner and his wife, and a handful of curious townspeople. Elizabeth wore a blue dress purchased from the mercantile, the only concession to bridal tradition. The vows were simple, the ring a plain gold band that had belonged to Zach's mother. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Zach's kiss was brief but tender, a promise rather than a passion. They returned to the cabin, their home now in the golden light of late afternoon. Zach had spent the previous day building a proper bedstead to replace his bachelor's cot, and Elizabeth had sewn curtains for the windows from fabric he'd bought in town. Small changes, but significant in their meaning. That night, as they prepared for bed, an awkwardness fell between them that hadn't existed before. Elizabeth, brushing her hair by the fire, felt Zach's eyes on her but couldn't read his expression. I know this isn't what either of us planned, she said finally, setting down the brush. And I know that this child I'm carrying is a complication. Zach crossed the room to stand before her, his height making her feel strangely delicate despite her pregnant state. Life rarely goes according to plan, Elizabeth. My father used to say that a man who can't adjust to changing trails won't last long in the mountains. He reached out tentatively to touch her cheek. I don't see your child as a complication. I see it as part of the woman I've chosen to marry. His words dissolved the tension that had built between them. When he leaned down to kiss her, Elizabeth met him halfway, her heart racing with an emotion she hadn't expected to feel again after Thomas's death hope. Their marriage began as most things do in frontier life, with work. The next morning brought no honeymoon leisure, just the usual chores and responsibilities. Zach rode into town to inquire about the teaching position, returning with news that the town council was eager to meet with Elizabeth the following week. They seemed pleased at the prospect of a qualified teacher, he reported as they ate supper. Especially one with formal education. Elizabeth smiled, pleased that her years at the ladies' seminary might prove useful after all. Did they mention the salary? $30 a month, with the schoolhouse including living quarters should you need them. He glanced at her. Which you won't, of course, but it's good to know they're available. It was a fair salary for a frontier teacher, enough to give her a measure of independence even within their marriage. The knowledge eased a worry she hadn't fully acknowledged. As the days passed, they settled into a partnership that grew more comfortable with each shared meal, each evening conversation by the fire. Zach taught her about the horses he bred and trained, his passion for the animals evident in every word. Elizabeth shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her teaching experiences in Missouri, her hopes for the child she carried. They learned each other's habits and preferences. Zach liked his coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in, while Elizabeth preferred hers with a touch of honey. He whistled when he worked, old trail songs that spoke of longing and wide open spaces. She talked to plants as she established a small kitchen garden, a habit that made him smile when he thought she wasn't looking. Physical intimacy developed slowly between them, beginning with casual touches his hand at the small of her back as they walked, her fingers brushing his when she passed him a cup of coffee. The first time he reached for her in the darkness of their bedroom, his touch was questioning rather than demanding. Elizabeth's response left no doubt about her willingness, and they discovered in each other's arms a connection that transcended their practical arrangement. Afterward, lying beside him with her head on his chest, Elizabeth felt the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek and marveled at the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this moment. "What are you thinking?" Zach murmured, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "That sometimes being lost is the only way to be found," she replied. He chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "That's mighty philosophical for a woman who claimed just yesterday that pregnancy was addling her brain." Elizabeth smiled against his skin. "Perhaps you've been a good influence. Or perhaps," he said more seriously, lifting her chin so their eyes met, "we've been good for each other." The realization that she was falling in love with her husband came to Elizabeth gradually, like the changing of seasons impossible to pinpoint the exact moment when spring becomes summer, but unmistakable once it had occurred. The practical arrangement they had agreed to had transformed into something neither had anticipated, but both now cherished. The town council approved her appointment as Black Hawk's new teacher, and as summer ripened toward fall, Elizabeth divided her time between preparing the schoolhouse for the coming term and readying the cabin for the baby's arrival. Zach built a cradle from pine harvested on their land, his large hands surprisingly deft as he shaped and smoothed the wood. "My father was a carpenter before he caught gold fever," he explained when she commented on his skill. "He taught me the basics before we left Kansas." Elizabeth ran her hands over the finished cradle, marveling at the perfect joints and the delicate scrollwork he had carved along the sides. "It's beautiful, Zach. A family heirloom in the making." His smile held a touch of sadness. "I hope so. Never thought I'd have cause to build one after Sarah died." It was the first time he had mentioned his lost fiancée since their marriage, and Elizabeth recognized the significance of his openness. "Tell me about her," she said gently, "if you'd like to." They sat on the porch that evening, watching twilight paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, and Zach spoke of the girl he had once planned to marry, her laughter, her love of books, the future they had imagined together. Elizabeth shared memories of Thomas, in return his steadfast nature, his dream of owning land, the joy on his face when she had told him about the baby. "Grief's a strange thing," Zach said as night fell around them. "It never really leaves you, but somehow it makes room for new joy alongside the sorrow." Elizabeth reached for his hand in the darkness. "I'm glad we found each other, Zach, even if it took a storm to make it happen." "Especially because it took a storm," he replied, squeezing her fingers. "It was worth getting soaked to the skin to find you half drowned in that ravine." She laughed, shoving his shoulder playfully. "How romantic. I'm sure every woman dreams of being remembered as half drowned." His laughter joined hers, echoing across the yard where fireflies had begun to rise like earthbound stars. The baby decided to make its appearance 2 weeks before Elizabeth's due date, on a crisp October morning when the aspen trees had turned to gold. The first contraction woke her before dawn, strong enough to make her gasp. Zach was instantly alert beside her. "Is it time?" he asked, already reaching for his clothes. Elizabeth nodded, a mixture of excitement and fear washing over her. "I think so, but it's still early." "I'll fetch Dr. Warner," Zach said, pulling on his boots. And Mrs. Oakhurst, she's helped bring half the babies in the county into the world. By the time he returned with both the doctor and the midwife, Elizabeth's labor had progressed steadily. Mrs. Oakhurst, a stout woman with capable hands and a no-nonsense manner, took charge immediately. First babies often take their time, she informed Elizabeth as she checked her condition. But you're doing fine, my dear. Just fine. Zach hovered anxiously until Dr. Warner suggested firmly that he might be more useful tending to the horses. We'll call you when there's news, the doctor promised. Banished to the barn, Zach threw himself into work with unusual intensity, mucking stalls that were already clean and checking tack that had been inspected only days before. When the sound of a baby's cry finally reached him, the curry brush he had been holding clattered to the floor. He ran to the cabin, taking the porch steps 2 at a time, but hesitated at the door, suddenly uncertain of his place in this moment. "Come in, Mr. Holcomb," Mrs. Oakhurst called from inside. "Come and meet your son." A son. The word echoed in his mind as he entered the cabin, his heart pounding harder than it had during any stampede or gun battle. Elizabeth lay on their bed, exhausted but radiant, a small bundle cradled in her arms. She looked up as he approached, her smile brighter than he had ever seen it. "He has your eyes," she said softly. Zach knelt beside the bed, gazing in wonder at the tiny face peering out from the blanket. Blue eyes, indeed, stared back at him with an intensity that belied the child's newness to the world. "He's perfect," Zach whispered, reaching out a tentative finger to touch the baby's cheek. "What will you call him?" "Thomas Zachary Wilson Holcomb," Elizabeth replied, "if that suits you." Emotion closed Zach's throat, making speech impossible for a moment. He nodded, blinking rapidly against the unexpected burn of tears. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked. With infinite care, Zach took the child in his arms, marveling at how light yet substantial he felt. Thomas Zachary studied his face with solemn concentration, tiny fingers flexing against the blanket. "Hello, little man," Zach murmured. "Welcome to the world." In that moment, looking down at the child who bore his name though not his blood, Zach understood that family was not merely a matter of shared heritage, but of chosen bonds, of promises made and kept. He glanced up to find Elizabeth watching them, tears tracing silver paths down her cheeks. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing she would understand all that those 2 words encompassed. The days following Thomas Zachary's birth passed in a blur of exhaustion and joy. Elizabeth recovered quickly, her natural vitality reasserting itself despite the demands of motherhood. Zach found himself enchanted by the smallest details of his son's existence, the perfect miniature fingernails, the surprising strength of his grip, the various expressions that crossed his face, even in sleep. Visitors came to offer congratulations and gifts. Mrs. Oakhurst with a quilt she had pieced herself, Dr. Warner with a silver cup engraved with the baby's birth date, townsfolk with practical offerings of food and baby clothes. Even Randall Tillman and his sons rode over, bringing a hand-carved rocking horse that the oldest Tillman boy had crafted. "For when he's a bit bigger," Tillman said gruffly, the gesture of goodwill surprising after the tension of their previous encounter. "That's mighty generous of you," Zach acknowledged, accepting the gift with the same spirit in which it was offered. "Would you care to come in for coffee?" The visit marked a turning point in relations between the 2 men. While they would never be close friends, a certain respect had been established. When Tillman mentioned again his interest in Zach's water rights, the discussion remained civil. "I've been thinking on it," Zach said as they stood by the corral, watching his horses graze. "I won't sell outright, but I might consider a shared-use arrangement. Your cattle on the north side, my horses on the south, with agreed-upon access times for watering. Tillman's bushy eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's reasonable. What changed your mind?" Zach glanced toward the cabin where Elizabeth could be seen through the window, rocking Thomas Zachary. "Let's just say I've learned there's value in finding middle ground." As winter settled over the Colorado mountains, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into a glittering wonderland, life in the Holcomb cabin developed its own rhythm. Elizabeth delayed the start of her teaching until spring, focusing instead on her son and on making their home more comfortable. Zach worked through the cold months breaking the youngest colts, preparing them for sale when the trails cleared. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Thomas Zachary sleeping peacefully in his cradle while they talked of the future. Elizabeth spoke of expanding the garden come spring, perhaps adding chickens for fresh eggs. Zach described his plans for building additional corrals and perhaps breeding a line of horses specifically for stagecoach companies. "I've been saving to buy a pair of matched Morgans from a breeder in Denver," he confided one night as snow tapped gently against the windows. Strong, steady animals with good bloodlines could be the foundation of something special. "You should do it," Elizabeth encouraged, curled beside him on the settee he had traded a yearling colt to acquire. "You have a gift with horses, Zach. Everyone says so." He caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I have a gift for recognizing value when I see it," he said, his eyes holding hers, "in horses and in people." The words he had not yet spoken hung between them, palpable as the warmth from the fire. Elizabeth felt her heart quicken as he leaned closer. "I love you, Elizabeth," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that wasn't part of our arrangement, but there it is. I've fallen in love with you and with that boy of ours." Joy flooded through her, bright and fierce. "And I love you, Zachary Holcomb, have for some time now." His kiss was different from any they had shared before, not tentative or restrained, but deep and certain, a seal on declarations too long unspoken. Later, much later, as they lay entwined in the darkness of their bedroom, Zach traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "When did you know?" he asked. "That I loved you," Elizabeth smiled, though he couldn't see it in the darkness. "I think it started that first night in the storm when you carried me to safety and told me to rest. But I didn't recognize it until I saw you building Thomas Zachary's cradle, putting so much care into every detail." She turned to face him, finding his eyes in the dimness. "When did you know?" "The moment you accepted my hand at the ravine," he admitted. "Soaking wet in labor and still fighting to survive. I thought, there's a woman worth building a life with. Everything since has only confirmed it." Spring arrived in a rush of melting snow and new growth. The creek that ran through their property swelled with runoff from the mountains, and wildflowers appeared in sheltered places almost overnight. Thomas Zachary, now 6 months old, watched the changing world with wide-eyed fascination from his mother's arms or his father's shoulders. Elizabeth began teaching at the Black Hawk schoolhouse, riding in 3 days a week while Zach cared for their son. The arrangement raised a few eyebrows in town, but the quality of her instruction soon silenced any criticism. Under her guidance, enrollment increased as families who had previously kept their children home to help with chores saw the value in education. Zach made his journey to Denver to purchase the Morgan horses, returning with not only the matched pair he had planned for but also a surprise, a gentle mare with a white star on her forehead. "For you," he told Elizabeth as she admired the beautiful animal. "Every teacher needs a reliable way to get to school." The mare, whom Elizabeth named Stella for her star, proved to be as steady and intelligent as promised. Thomas Zachary delighted in being carried on horseback, his laughter ringing out whenever they rode together around the property. Summer brought new developments. The water-sharing arrangement with Tillman proved successful enough that other ranchers in the area began adopting similar agreements, reducing the tensions that had long simmered over land and water rights. Zach's horse breeding operation gained recognition beyond the local area, with buyers coming from as far as Kansas City to inspect his stock. Elizabeth's school term ended with a celebration that brought the entire community together. Her students presented recitations and songs, demonstrating their progress to proud parents. When the school board announced that her position would continue the following year with an increase in salary, the news was met with enthusiastic applause. "You've changed this town," Zach told her that night as they celebrated privately at home, "given those children something they needed without knowing it." Elizabeth shook her head, smiling. "I've only given them tools. They've done the real work themselves." She hesitated before adding, "I've been thinking, Zach, about our family." He set down his coffee cup, giving her his full attention. "What about it? Thomas Zachary is growing so quickly, he'll be walking before we know it." She reached across the table to take his hand. "I think he might enjoy having a brother or sister, someone to share this wonderful life with." Understanding dawned in Zach's eyes, followed by a smile that transformed his face. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" She nodded, her own smile mirroring his. "Dr. Warner confirmed it yesterday. We're expecting another child come winter." Zach was around the table in an instant, gathering her into his arms and lifting her off her feet in his excitement. "Elizabeth Holcomb, you continue to amaze me," he said when he finally set her down. "A teacher, a mother, a wife beyond compare. Is there anything you can't do?" She laughed, flushed with happiness. "Find my way in a thunderstorm, apparently. Thank goodness for handsome cowboys with lanterns." "Thank goodness indeed," he agreed, pulling her close again. "Though I think we've weathered enough storms now to last us a lifetime." Elizabeth rested her head against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "Some storms bring destruction," she mused, "but others clear the way for new beginnings." Outside, the first stars appeared in the twilight sky, shining down on the cabin that had become a home, on the family forged not by blood alone but by choice and circumstance, and love that had grown in the most unexpected of places. Winter returned to the Colorado mountains, bringing with it the birth of their daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Holcomb, named for both the woman Zach had once loved and the mother who now held his heart. Unlike her brother's early arrival, Sarah chose to make her entrance into the world during a peaceful snowfall 2 days after Christmas. "She has your spirit," Zach declared, cradling his newborn daughter while Thomas Zachary, now 15 months old, peered curiously at his sister from Elizabeth's arms, determined to do things in her own time and her own way. Elizabeth laughed, though the sound held a touch of weariness after the long labor. "Heaven help us if that's true. One stubborn Holcomb in the family is quite enough." "Two," Zach corrected with a grin, nodding toward Thomas Zachary, who had inherited his mother's determination along with her auburn hair. "Soon to be 3, I'd wager." Their laughter mingled in the warm air of the cabin, a sound of contentment and belonging that neither had dared hope for when they'd made their practical arrangement just over a year before. As spring melted the snow once more, bringing new life to the land, Zach and Elizabeth stood together on the porch of their expanded cabin. A new room had been added for the children, and the kitchen enlarged to accommodate Elizabeth's growing collection of herbs and preserves. Thomas Zachary toddled in the yard, chasing butterflies with delighted squeals, while Sarah slept peacefully in a sling across her mother's chest. In the pasture beyond, Zach's horses grazed alongside new foals, the breeding program having exceeded even his optimistic expectations. "Do you ever think about that night in the storm?" Elizabeth asked, leaning against her husband's solid strength. "How different our lives might have been if you hadn't seen me, or if I'd managed to reach Black Hawk on my own." Zach's arm tightened around her shoulders. "I try not to dwell on might-have-beens, but I do thank God every day that I was pig-headed enough to go check my fence line during a thunderstorm. And I thank Him that I was stubborn enough to believe I could outrun the weather," Elizabeth replied with a smile. Their lives had been shaped by those choices: a man who ventured out in dangerous weather, a woman who risked travel while heavy with child, but also by the decisions they had made afterward. To offer shelter, to accept help, to build a partnership that became a marriage in truth as well as name. To create a family bound by love rather than obligation. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Zach turned to face his wife, taking both her hands in his. "I've been meaning to tell you something," he said, his expression serious despite the warmth in his eyes. Elizabeth tilted her head, curious. "What is it?" "That night when I found you in the storm, when I said rest now, I meant it only for that moment." He brought her hands to his lips, kissing each one gently. "But I want you to know that as long as I live, you'll always have a place to rest, Elizabeth. A home, a haven, no matter what storms may come." Tears blurred her vision as she stretched up to kiss him. "And you'll always have my heart, Zachary Holcomb, from now until forever." In the yard, Thomas Zachary's laughter rang out as he discovered the joy of splashing in a puddle left by melted snow. Sarah stirred against her mother's chest, making small, contented sounds. And in the embrace of the mountains that had witnessed their beginning, a family that had been forged in storm and strengthened through love faced the future together, secure in the knowledge that they had found in each other not just shelter from life's tempests, but the courage to weather them side by side.